In this video, we're going to be adding in some tank death effects. Now, we are going to be building this from scratch, so we are going to be going over the process of creating this particle system. And this particle system is going to play whenever our tank is actually dead. So whenever the tank health is at 0, we're then going to initiate this particle effect. Now, this particle effect is going to be a layered effect. So we're going to have different types of particle systems playing all at once. We're going to start off by actually having a base explosion. This is going to be a stylized explosion to create that kind of cartoonish effect, and we're going to be using a sprite sheet for this. Next, we're going to have a couple of 3D based particle effects. So these are going to be the gears. We're going to use a couple of gears here to simulate that the gears have popped off the tank and exploded. And then we're also going to do the same thing for the top turret and the barrel. So let's get started by looking at the sprite sheet. In the particle effects folder, you'll find textures, open that up, and you'll find the explosion stylized. Okay, so this is a sprite sheet. We are going to be using this as the base of our explosion. This was actually created inside of Blender, and then I compiled it together into a sprite sheet by using the VFX image sequencer tool by Unity. So we're going to be using this as our particle system. We're just going to be using the sprite sheet to create the effect, so we don't have to have all these kind of fancy particles within our game. We can just use this with one particle, and then we can have this explosion stylized effect. So let's start off by adding this to our tank. So I want to center this up with the tank itself. These are going to be built separately, and then we'll combine them together at the end. So we'll start off by first creating the explosion particle effect. So I'm going to right click in a hierarchy here, go to effects, and then particle system. Let's rename this to explosion. And I'm just going to pause this for now. So what I want to do is I want to try to get this in the center point of our tank here. Okay, I think something like that will be good. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do with this particle effect is I want to add the sprite sheet. Now, the sprite sheet has been added to a material already for you. So if you take a look at the effects materials, go into explosion and you'll find it in there. So here I assigned a texture, which is the sprite sheet, and I'm using a shader of alpha blended from the particles section. The tint color up here is a kind of light grayish. I didn't go full white. I just went with the light gray here. And then the alpha value is set all the way up to 255. By default, I believe it's somewhere a little bit lower, in which case you're going to lose a little bit of the detail within the sprite sheet. So I just bumped this all the way up to 255. Okay, so let's add that to the explosion particle effect. So in the explosion particle effect, if you go all the way down to the very bottom, you'll find the renderer. Open that up. And here you have the section for the material. So let's drag the explosion material into that slot. Okay, so now we can see our texture being applied to each individual particle here. We don't need as many particles. Again, like I said before, we're just going to use one particle. So we're done with the renderer for now. We can close that up, and now we can start off at the very top. Okay, so at the very top, I want to ensure that the duration is quite short. We're just going to keep this down to 2 seconds. So set it to 2. The start lifetime, we'll just set this up to 1. Now for these particles, we're not going to have them actually moving up like we have right now. So we don't need a start speed. We can actually set that down to 0. The start size, we'll leave this at 10 because we want this to be big enough so that it actually encompasses our tank. Now, our tank is going to be destroyed when this particle effect is played, but we want to make sure it looks big enough for our tank. So start size of 10 will work. Let's jump down to the max particles down below the rigid body section here. We'll set that up to say 10 as well. We're only going to have one particle. So in the emission, we're going to set the rate over time down to 0. We're going to do this based off the burst section right here. So we don't need rate over time. We'll set that to 0. I'll click the plus icon there to add in a section for burst. And again, we're just using 1. So right here where it says count, set that down to 1. Now, right now it's set to looping. So if I click on play up here, it's going to loop over and over. I'm going to uncheck that for now. We're just going to have this play once. So make sure that looping is unchecked. Now we're not done yet. Since we are using a sprite sheet, we need to ensure that we just use the individual frames of that sprite sheet. So let's jump down to the texture sheet animation and let's enable that. Now within here, we have a section for tiles. So we need to specify which set of tiles we're going to be going through. If we go back to the explosion, this is actually 5 by 9. Now it's a little bit hard to see at the very bottom here, but it does go all the way down to 9. So the x-axis is going to be 5 across. The y-axis is 9 down. So let's go back into the texture sheet animation node and we'll switch the tiles here to X. of 5, and Y of 9. Everything else is going to be kept exactly the same. Now, when I click on play, you should be able to see the particle effect playing as intended. So it's going through each individual frame of that sprite sheet and playing it as an animation. If we move it up a bit, we can actually see a little bit better. Now, again, when we actually play this, the tank is going to be destroyed. So it's not going to be obstructed by the tank. We want to make sure it's big enough for our tank. Okay, so I'll move this back down. Now, the other thing that I want with this is a light. So when we click on play, you can see it does have that orangey light glow to it, but we don't actually have any kind of heat source coming off that. We don't have any kind of light. So when I click on play, it just looks kind of bland. So let's add some light to this so it actually looks like it actually disperses light whenever we have that explosion. Now with this, we can use the light module here. So if we enable that, we can use a light with this. And at the very top, we need an actual light to use this with. So let's add a light to the explosion particle effect. We're going to use a point light. So right click on explosion, go to light, point light. Now with the point light, we're going to be adjusting the intensity and the color. We'll leave the range at 10. You could decrease this if you want, but this is the range of our light. So we want the color to match basically the color of the explosion, which is going to be kind of like a orangey yellowish color. So let's open this up and let's pick something a bit more orange. Now for the intensity right now, it's set up to 1. If I actually move up the explosion, we can see this a bit better. So we have the kind of light glow of the orange light on there. And what we want to do is actually increase this using a curve. So if I increase this all the way up to 3, you can see how bright it gets. And basically what we want to do is we want to create this very quick transition between the intensities. So we'll leave it at 1 for now, and we're going to be modifying this through the light module. So go back to the explosion. Let's assign the light at the very top there, which will be the point light. Now for the ratio, we need to set this up to 1, so we use at least 1 light. And let's also do the same thing for the maximum lights down below. We just need 1 light. Okay, so now when I click on play for the particle effect, we should see that light appear. Okay, so every time I play that, you should see the bright glow of the light. But it's pure white and it kind of pops in and pops out. So take a look at how we can modify that. So first off, the reason why it's white is because we're using the particle color. Now we're actually using a sprite sheet, which means that we didn't actually need to modify the start color here. We're actually taking the colors from the images within the sprites themselves. So it's basing this off this start color here. We can uncheck that, and now we can start using the color of the actual light. Okay, so far so good. Now let's fix the issue with the popping in and popping out. Now, like I mentioned before, we are going to be modifying the intensity. So we're going to be using a curve with this, so it actually slowly goes to a brighter color and then comes back down. So we're going to have a curve that goes up and down like a hill. We can do this by going to the intensity multiplier and changing it from constant to curve. Right now, it's at a default value of 1. If we left click on this value here, we can change it to 3. So type in 3, then hit enter. And we want to start off at a value of 1. That is our default. So let's move this all the way down. Just left click on the key, move it down to 1. And then we want this to actually go up to 3, but we want this to match what we have for the explosion. So if I click on play right now, you can see it kind of stays a little bit after the explosion appears. So maybe move this over here a bit, click on play. Okay, that matches a little bit better, but now we want it to go back down to 0. We don't want to have any kind of light whatsoever after the explosion is done. And more specifically, the orange portion of the particle effect. So I'm going to add another key here. I'm going to right click on it, maybe right about here, add key, and we'll drag this all the way down to 0. Okay, much better. Now it does appear a little bit faster. So if you want to slow it down, what you could do is actually just drag this out a bit more. Okay, it's a bit more gradual that way. If you want to keep it brighter, add another key up here. And just stretch this out. Maybe move this up a bit. So it stays at 3 for a little bit longer. But that may be a little bit too much. So again, just tweak this to your liking. If I just keep a few up here, kind of close together. Okay, I think that looks good right there. Okay, so we're done with the lights module. Let's take a look at another subtle effect we can add to this, which is have it grow slightly over its lifetime. We can do that by using the size over lifetime module. So when I click play right now, it stays the exact same size, and that's fine, but we could also have it grow a little bit over time. So let's go to the size over lifetime over here, and we'll use the defaults here. So it's going up from 0 all the way up to 1. Let's actually use a gradual curve. Now in this case, I don't want to start off at 0. So if I click on play, you can see how it's a lot more apparent whenever we actually see that grow. So we want to start off at a much higher value and just have a very subtle growing effect. So let's move this first key here. Let's go all the way up to 0.7. Make sure that it doesn't go past 1 right there. Maybe even 0.8 for a more subtle effect. Okay, there we go. So you can see it does grow slightly. And it's a bit of a subtle effect, but it does look nicer. Okay, so we're done with the main explosion. Now let's add in a couple of 3D effects. This is going to be the gear effect. So we're going to have these gears actually pop up out of the explosion to simulate that these gears are actually flying off the tank. Now I have provided a model for this. So in the models folder, go into the gear and you'll find a gear model. This is a low poly version of this because the current gears on here are actually just planes. So I do want to have a low poly version of this. So it's going to create a particle effect for this, and then we're going to be using the same material that we have on these guys here. This is just a kind of like an example of what it looks like on the gear. Once again, we'll move this towards the center of the tank here. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do with this is we want to apply the material and also the mesh for that specific gear. We'll do this in the renderer. So go all the way down to the very bottom. We're going to change the render mode here from billboard to mesh. From there, you can then select a mesh in here. By default, it's set to cube. Open this up and select the mesh that you want to use. In this case, we'll use the gear. It's also provide the material that we're using on the gears on the tank. So I'll open this up, and there are two exact named materials here. They're both called tank underscore gear. Select this one right here that has the kind of blackish look to it. Okay, great. We're done with the renderer. Let's close this up. Now let's jump up to the very top, and we want to modify both the size of this and also the speed of it. So we'll leave the duration at 5 seconds, but we'll set the start lifetime down to say 3. The start speed, we're actually going to increase this a bit up to say 10. And the reason why we want to do that is because we are going to be applying a gravity to this. So we're going to be applying the gravity modifier to this to have this actually fly up in the air, then come back down due to gravity. Right now, they're just kind of flying up in the air. So we want these to actually be modified so it actually falls down to the ground. So we can do that by using the gravity modifier. Let's bump this up to say 2. Okay, and you can see they basically just kind of pop out like that. Let's also increase the size of these. So for the start size, it's set to 1. So we get these very, very small particles. Let's bump this up to say 20. Okay, much better. Now I want these to actually fly up a bit more. So let's increase the start speed up to say 12. Okay, I think that looks good right there. Maybe move this up slightly so it actually flies up a bit further. Now, I want each one of these particles, these mesh particles, to actually have some rotation so they don't all look like they're facing the same direction. So let's go down to the start rotation here and let's set this to a random between two constants. And we'll set this between, say, 10 and actually, let's go with a negative 45 and a positive 45. Okay, there we go. Now we have some random rotation being applied to the particles. Now, I want these actual particles to actually hit the ground and bounce and then stop and then slowly shrink over time. So right now they're going through the floor. So let's modify this in the collision. So jump down to the collision. Let's enable that. And right when we do that, you can see all these green outlines. These are actually the colliders. By default, the colliders are way too big for the gears. So let's go down and let's adjust that first. So right here where it says radius scale, it's set to 1. Let's decrease that to say 0.05. And even that's a little bit too big. Let's bring this down even further, down to say 0.035. Okay, much better. Okay, so we fixed the collider issue, but it's not actually colliding with anything on the ground here. So we need to actually provide the object that we're going to be colliding with. Now, at the very top of the collision module, we have a section here to provide a transform. So this is the object that's going to collide with the particles. So let's go into the environment and we'll drag in the floor. Okay, so there we go. Now it's bouncing on the ground. Next, we're going to add in a few other things. So let's modify the bounce of this. We don't want these to actually bounce as much. And we also want to dampen it. So we'll set dampen here to 0.5. This will slow it down. Let's also adjust the bounce down to say 0.25. Okay, so that's good right there. And basically we want these to stop and then shrink over time. Now we have way too many particles for this. All I want to have is about 5 particles for this. So we're done with the collision for now. We can close this up. Let's modify the emission of how many particles we have. So first off, let's set the max particles down to say 10. And the emission here is not going to be rate over time. We're not going to be looping this. We're just using this as a demonstration. We'll set this down to 0. And we're going to be using burst once again. So we'll set this to a count of 5. Okay, so something like that would be good. Now, when we click on play, you can see that these all group together typically. So we have a few over here. We have a few over here. We can modify this so it actually shoots straight up and then goes out in random directions. So let's modify the shape a bit. So I'm going to move this up just slightly, right about there. So I want to adjust the actual radius and also the angle. So if we adjust the angle to be a little bit wider, it's actually going to shoot out in kind of a wider arc. So we can do that by adjusting the angle here. Let's bring this up to say 35. And then for the radius, we'll bring this down a bit further. So maybe about 0.25. There we go. That looks a lot better. Okay, so that's it for the shape. The last thing that we want to do is actually have these shrink over time. So right now, if we click on play, you can see they hit the ground and just pop away. So we can modify that by using the size over lifetime, very similar to how we did this before. So size over lifetime, let's enable that. And for this curve here, we want this to actually start off at 1 and then go all the way down to 0. So we're going to reverse this by using one of the presets in here. So I'll select this one right here, and we have a nice gradual curve downward. Now, if I click on play, they're going to start shrinking as they're coming out. I actually want them to stay in that same size until maybe about the end of their life. So we can modify our curve so that we're not automatically shrinking right from the very start. So let's add in a key right here. Right click on it, go to add key. We'll move this up and we'll keep it at 1 for a good duration, maybe about right here or so will be fine. So it's going to stay that same size and then drop off down here. We can curve this up a bit more. That'll be good right there. Okay, so it's going to stay that size and then shrink over time. Okay, great. Let's make sure that this is not set to looping, so let's uncheck this for now. Again, we're going to be playing this ourselves automatically. Okay, so we're going to be doing something very similar with the turret and the barrel. We're going to be modifying the gear particle effect. We're going to duplicate this, then modify it so we can use the turret and the barrel for it as well. So let's start off with the turret. Now with the turret, I want this to actually match the same position as the actual turret itself. I'm talking about this base object here. So let's make sure that we move this up. And I also want to make sure that the rotation matches. So 0. Let's see. I want the z-axis to point in this direction. So I rotate it this way. Okay, so after you position that and rotate it, make sure that you add in the new mesh, which is going to be the turret itself. So again, go down to the very bottom under renderer, We'll swap out the gear here for the new mesh, which is going to be the turret. And let's also make sure that we assign the new material. In this case, it's going to be specific to the tank that you're using. We do have different skins for these tanks. So for the material, I'm going to open this up. So in this case, my tank is green. So I'll use the tank green. We also have red and tan. In this case, you may want to have different effects for each individual tank. So click on the tank green. Okay, let's give this a quick test. Now you can see when we hit play, we have all these very, very large turret pieces. And that's because the size is set to 20. So let's jump up to the very top. We're going to keep the same duration and all that stuff in here, but we want to modify the start size down to 1. Okay, much better. Okay, so we only want to shoot out one of these turrets. So let's modify the emission. So instead of 5, we're going to shoot out 1. Okay, so far so good, but you can see it's actually shooting it out straight from below the tank. Let's have this actually shoot up a bit more. Let's take a look at the shape. So for the shape here, I'm going to rotate this so it points up. There we go. Maybe at an angle forward. Okay, so I'm happy with the orientation of that. Let's continue on with this. So let's make a few more modifications. If I click on play once again, you can see that piece actually gets stuck in the ground. That's because of the size of the collider. So let's go back down into the collision. And let's set the radius scale here up to 0.5. Okay, it's still clipping through. Let's bump this up to a value of 1. Okay, much better. Okay, great. So now we're done with the turret. Let's also do the same thing for the barrel. So this will be pretty simple. Just duplicate the turret. Rename it to barrel. Make sure you move it up so it matches the position of the barrel. Okay, so once again, go down to the renderer, just modify the mesh. We don't need to modify the material because we have the exact same material for both of these. Okay, so that looks pretty good for the most part. So for both the turret and the barrel, they both have rotation being applied to it. So again, if we go up to the right top, it's between -45 and 45. You may not want to have rotation for these because we want to match this as close as possible. So I'm going to set this to a constant, and I'm just going to set this down to 0. Now we'll do that for both of these. Now, if you do modify the rotation, make note of the rotation of the particle as it's coming out. As you can see here, the barrel is actually coming out at an angle, which doesn't match what we have here. So I could just rotate this so it better matches. So we're done with the turret and the barrel. Let's actually take a look at all three of these combined with the explosion. So we'll drag those underneath the explosion, and then we'll click on play to see them all work together. So close up the shape modules for these to make sure that they don't actually occlude our view here. Okay, I think that's looking pretty good so far. Now we're going to add in one more thing, and that's going to be a shockwave effect along the ground here. This is going to be very similar to what we did with the actual ball. So whenever the ball actually hits the container or wall, we have that kind of distortion effect of a shockwave. We're going to be doing something very similar here, except we're going to have a shockwave on the ground of our tank. So let's go ahead and create a new particle effect. And we'll call this shockwave. Now I do have the material already created for this, so we can take a look at that. Let's add this to the renderer. So the material is actually found in the particle effects. And if we take a look at the effects materials, you'll find one called a shockwave. So this is very similar to what we had for the ball impacts. The only difference here is if this has a slightly different normal map. Okay, so we're going to be using this with our particle effect. Let's go to shockwave. Okay, so let's add this to the renderer. And now we can actually see what this looks like. So if I move this around with the particles actually pause like this, we can see the distortion. Now again, with this, we only want to have one particle. So we're done with the renderer. Let's go up to the top section here. This is going to be a very short particle effect. So the duration, again, we'll set this down to 1 second this time. And the start lifetime is going to be 0.5. So a very quick effect. We're not going to have any kind of speed to this. So we'll set this down to 0. Very similar to what we did before. For the max particles, we'll set this down to say 5. Then the emission, we'll set it down to 0 for the rate over time. And for the burst, we'll set this up to 3. Okay, now I did mention we are just going to have one of these. We could just use one, but with 3, it actually amplifies the effect a bit more. Okay, so as you can see there, when we click on play, we see all 3 particle effects are kind of off center. So we need to modify this by adjusting the shape. We're not going to be using a shape at all, so we can uncheck that. So all 3 of them are going to appear in the exact same center. Now I want to modify this so it actually expands and grows over time, and I don't want it to stay in the exact same shape the entire time. So we need to modify this by using the size over lifetime. So let's enable the size over lifetime. Click on the curve, and you can see how it grows right now. Now I want this to grow a little bit more. The size is a little bit too small for me. So let's increase the start size at the very top here to 10. Okay, much better. Okay, so as you can see here, the particle effect is actually facing the camera at all times, no matter which way I look at this. Now with the tank, I want this shockwave to be on the ground. I don't want it to be facing the camera at all times. So we need to change the view of this so we're not looking at it as a billboard, but instead as a local object. We can do this in the renderer section of the particle effect. So going back down here, we have the render mode set to billboard at the very top here. Let's change the render alignment from view down to local. So now when I click on play, you can see it no longer appears based off my view. But now I need to actually rotate this because this is actually facing underground. So let's rotate it along the x-axis here. And we'll do this in the transform. So right now it's at -90. Let's set this up to a +90. And there we go. Okay, the last thing that we can do is we can try to maybe fade this out. So let's do this using the color over lifetime. Let's enable that. Left click on the gradient editor. And at the very top here, we have these values for the alpha. Now I want this to fade in and fade out. So I'm going to add in a new point in here by left clicking at the very top. We'll add one there and we'll also add one here. So we'll set the location here for 75. The second one right here is going to be 25. These will have a full alpha value. And for these guys on either end, we'll set the alpha all the way down to 0. So we're going to start off at a transparent value, go to full color, and then again fade out. Now this may or may not work with this effect, but we're going to add it in anyways. Okay, so we're done with the shockwave effect. We're done with the main particle effects. Let's add this to the explosion. So I'll center this up, 0, 0, 0. And then I'll move it down along the z-axis here, which is local to this object. Just enough so that it actually touches the ground. Right about there would be good. Okay, now we're done with this. Let's uncheck looping. Let's test this out with the explosion. So I'll click on play. Now, a small detail that you can add to your particle effect is to have a slight delay. So on the gear, turret, and barrel, maybe even a shockwave, we can add in a start delay here. So we have the explosion up here first, and then having a slight delay for the gear, turret, and barrel to actually explode out. So let's try a start delay of say 0.15. So it's a very subtle explosion effect, but you can see it does add to the emphasis of the explosion. Now, if you want the shockwave to be a little bit bigger, go back into the shockwave and adjust the start size up to 20. So there you go, it reaches out a little bit further. And then the last thing I want to do is just line this up as best as possible, so have it directly in the middle. And make sure that all the other particle effects are matched up properly with the tank. So we may need to move the turret and the barrel to better match, since we did move it slightly. Shockwave as well, make sure that's in the center. Now, last thing we'll add in is the audio source to actually play this audio clip, which is going to have the explosion audio clip whenever this particle effect plays. So let's add this to the particle system of the explosion. Down below, let's add components. Type in audio or audio source. And we'll add in the audio clip, which I have provided in here. It's called explosion. Drag that in. And then we'll have play auto wake checked on, so it plays the audio automatically. I do want to reduce the volume down to say 0.25. It is a loud audio clip. And then for the spatial blend, we don't want this to be a 2D audio clip. It should be 3D. So we should have some attenuation along with this. So since we are making this a 3D audio clip, let's also adjust the max distance here to 50. So if I zoom out here, you can actually see the range of that audio. And lastly, we'll add this as a child of the tank itself.